The basalt megalith of the triumvirate assembly chamber absorbed the light of 100 simulated suns, yet the air remained cold, a physical manifestation of the dread that had settled upon the gathered delegates, the primary governing bodies of the allied systems. Elder Counselor Varthos of the Xantaskrell, his chitinous carapace a dull, reflective black against the pulsating glyphs of the central dais, felt the immense, crushing weight of history, a silent, perpetual echo of the last time this assembly had convened under the shadow of Saul. That previous gathering, now a forgotten age ago in the rapid chronology of the Alliance, had been marked by a raw, frenzied hubris, an easy consensus that the Terran species, young, volatile, and impossibly fractured, could be easily subdued, their nascent stellar dominion partitioned like a simple, unclaimed nebula. The memory of the subsequent and immediate catastrophic reversal, the sheer, unimaginable violence and surgical precision with which the Terrans had eviscerated the Alliance's punitive fleets, remained a wound on the collective psyche, a philosophical scar that no treaty or time had managed to fully heal. Now the echoes had grown into a roar, the historical wound had begun to bleed anew, and the palpable tension in the vast, echoing hall was not of debate, but of preemptive mourning for the civilization they had so cavalierly risked antagonizing once more. Varthos slowly extended one of his 7 primary limbs, the movement a studied display of ancient Krell gravitas, a necessary counterpoint to the near-panicked whispers emanating from the delegate clusters of the Sarthian Mercantile Guild, and the militant, rigid-caste council of the Signian hegemony, who had championed the recent, ill-conceived encroachment that had triggered the current crisis. The colossal, holographic projection suspended over the dais was not a tactical map or a communication channel, but a single, perfectly rendered, unmoving icon. The planetary symbol for Earth, the blue marble veined with white and green, pristine and deceptively calm, a sphere of utter, chilling finality. It was an image of peace and a silent declaration of war, depending entirely on the perception of the viewer, and for the triumvirate, it had become the purest form of existential terror, a reminder that they were dealing not with a rival empire, but with a force that operated on a scale of consequence that defied established galactic norms, a species that had, after their initial devastating counterstrike, retreated into a self-imposed isolation, stating with absolute clarity that their borders were inviolable and their patience a finite resource. The present situation was a direct, arrogant testing of that stated limit, a desperate, final, and utterly foolish probe into the boundaries of the Terran consensus, an action undertaken by a splinter faction of the Alliance's outer march, driven by the seductive promise of exploiting a newly discovered, resource-rich cluster near the long-established but rigorously ignored Sol exclusion zone. The reports are confirmed and synthesized. Varthos's voice resonated through the chamber, low and deep, mechanically filtered to carry the weight of his office, the very sound designed to calm the inherent vibrational frequency of fear. The Scout Flotilla, the 9th Resource Assessment Group, dispatched by the Signian March Commander, has engaged with Terran defensive assets within the charted perimeter. This was not a border incident, nor a navigational error. It was a deliberate, aggressive probe, sanctioned in secret by elements of this very council who believed that the Terran consensus, after an age of silence, had atrophied, their legendary annihilation protocols, nothing more than a historical ghost story, a myth used to justify their unprecedented withdrawal. He paused, allowing the shame and the dawning terror to fully permeate the consciousness of the assembly. We now have the Terran response. It is not an engagement report. It is a single, transcribed message, delivered through an unbreakable, encrypted channel that bypassed all our security measures, an intrusion that speaks volumes of their current technological superiority. The message has been translated and verified for absolute linguistic fidelity. Let us not waste our remaining moments on internal recrimination. We must understand, with unclouded minds, what has transpired and what is now irrevocably set into motion. A subsidiary holoprojector flickered to life beside the still, ominous image of Earth. It displayed a single block of text in the formal, geometric script of the unified Terran language, accompanied by a voice recording of the transmission, a voice that was utterly calm, devoid of all inflection that could be interpreted as aggression, but carrying a tonal purity that was far more terrifying than any battle cry. The voice was synthesized, perfectly modulated, and genderless, a simple D. Dispassionate conduit for the most absolute of statements. Every delegate leaned in, their physiological processes slowing to a near halt, their breath catching in the throat sacs, Their optical sensors locked onto the words that now define the immediate future of the Allied systems. The chamber, moments before a cacophony of fear, descended into an immense, cavernous, and paralyzing silence. To the governing body of the Allied systems, triumvirate and associated organizations, the violation of the Sol exclusion zone by sanctioned military assets, designated Ninth Resource Assessment Group, has been detected, tracked, and registered as a deliberate act of war. This action directly contravenes the terms of the Treaty of Neutrality and Absolute Isolation, established following the initial hostile contact event. Be advised, the Terran Consensus has acted, not with a retaliatory strike, but with a calculated, absolute act of enforcement that transcends the previous first warning. The assets of the Ninth Group and the systems they originated from have been neutralized. The specific nature of this neutralization is not a matter for negotiation or review, but a matter of consequence. This communication serves as the final, absolute political and existential declaration. This is Earth's last warning to the Galactic Alliance. Attack again and be annihilated. There will be no further dialogue concerning this matter. The fate of your systems is now entirely dependent upon the immediate, verifiable cessation of all hostile, exploratory, or surveillance activity directed toward the consensus and its sovereign space. Termination of transmission. The synthesized voice cut out with the abrupt, clean finality of a diamond blade slicing through silk. The text remained, a monument to their collective folly. The silence that followed was so profound it felt like a collapse, a vacuum where sound and thought had previously existed. Varthos allowed the silence to draw out, a deliberate form of psychological torture, until the delegates began to stir, a low, collective moan of realization rippling through the hall. The words were simple, the grammar perfect, the meaning crystalline and terrifying. Neutralized. Not destroyed, not repelled, but neutralized. The psychological impact of that single term was immense, suggesting a level of control and efficiency that bypassed the chaotic brutality of traditional warfare. Neutralized, the Signian hegemon Kazal, a massive armored figure whose previous arrogance had been a pillar of the expansionist faction, finally managed to rasp, the sound metallic and strained. What does this mean, Counselor Varthos? Where is the tactical data? Where are the reports of the battle? Our vessels, they were not insubstantial. They possessed the latest shield spires and gravimetric pulse weaponry. To be neutralized it suggests that they did not even have the opportunity to fire. It suggests they were simply removed from the configuration of existence. Varthos turned his massive, multifaceted eyes to the hegemon, a cold, ancient weariness settling upon his gaze. Hegemon, we have only the sensor data provided by the nearest independent listening post, an asset of the neutral Arcanite conglomerate. The data is raw, unfiltered, and horrifying in its sparseness. The Ninth Group entered the perimeter at their scheduled coordinates. Standard Terran assets, automated sentinels entirely uncrewed of a class we have never before cataloged, responded. There was no exchange of fire. The sensor logs indicate the Terran assets initiated a single, highly localized, non-propagating energy discharge. A mere flicker. And then the Ninth Group, 7 heavy cruisers, 3 dedicated carriers, and their full complement of smaller craft, simply ceased to exist. Not a debris field, not a burst of ruptured plasma, not a single energy signature consistent with conventional destruction. Their mass, their energy, their very presence. It simply terminated at the subatomic level. The listening post's final recording is a silent void where a moment before there was a fleet of capital ships. A shiver of genuine philosophical terror ran through the assembled masses. This was not war. This was the imposition of a physical law that the Alliance did not possess the vocabulary to describe. The Terrans had not beaten them. They had demonstrated a mastery over the fundamental forces of the cosmos that bordered on the divine, a cold, surgical capacity to remove objects from reality without the messy collateral of a traditional engagement. The term annihilated in their warning was not a hyperbolic threat, but a technical specification. The sheer, chilling ethical implication of this capability, a technology so clean in its implementation yet so absolute in its finality, spoke volumes about the Terran mind. They possessed the means to end all life in the galaxy with the equivalent of a simple digital deletion, yet Hay had used it only to enforce an unbreakable boundary. This restraint was the most terrifying element of all. The nature of the neutralization is a philosophical problem for a time when we are certain of our continued existence, interjected Counselor Lyra of the Sarthian Guild, her voice a low, throbbing hum, the traditional vocalization of her species when attempting to assert logical control over emotional chaos. The immediate threat is political. They stated, the systems they originated from have been neutralized. That refers to the Cygnian March worlds, Hegemon K-Zal. They have demonstrated the capacity to perform this surgical removal remotely. What is the status of those worlds? Have they actually followed through on the unthinkable? Have they erased an entire system from the star charts? Hegemon K-Zal, the previously imposing figure, seemed to shrink, the rigid geometry of his armor now merely a shell around a core of utter defeat. Initial contact attempts have failed. No energy signatures, no communications, no distress signals from the three core March worlds of the outer rim. The sensors can still detect the star, but the planetary data, the planetary mass, is ambiguous. It is as if a section of the stellar accretion disk has been edited. We are awaiting the deep scan results, but the silence, Counselor Lyra, the absolute, cold silence where once there were billions of living entities and massive industrial complexes, speaks far louder than any confirmation. The Terrans do not bluff. Their words are merely the preamble to action, a necessary ethical preamble for a species that demands absolute adherence to the rules they themselves set forth. This was the crux of the profound historical misunderstanding. The Allied systems, products of millennia of chaotic, self-serving expansion and brutal, opportunistic warfare, viewed violence as a messy, emotional, and necessarily imperfect act. They saw diplomacy as a complicated game of calculated deceit, a necessary pause before the next strategic betrayal. The Terrans, however, presented a stark, cold contrast. Their previous declaration of isolation was not a strategic feint, but an absolute statement of ethical principle. Do not trespass or face absolute surgical consequence. The Alliance had mistaken this clear, dispassionate honesty for arrogance, their silence for weakness, and their restraint for lack of capability. They had projected their own chaotic, self-serving logic onto the Terran consensus, and now that projection had shattered, leaving them staring into the terrifying abyss of an opponent who was not merely more powerful, but fundamentally different in their understanding of power, war, and moral responsibility. The human ethical framework was not one of forgiveness and negotiation after a transgression. It was one of absolute, unyielding adherence to a pre-stated covenant. Break the covenant, and the consequence is not punishment, but simply the removal of the violator from the system. Varthos felt a weariness that went beyond the political, a philosophical fatigue born of watching a civilization repeat a fatal core mistake. He had argued against the aggressive probe, citing the historical records of the first warning, where Terran defensive fleets, vastly outnumbered, had performed maneuvers and deployed weapon systems that defied conventional physics, disassembling the Alliance's counterforce with minimal loss to themselves and an inexplicable precision that avoided unnecessary collateral damage to neutral systems. The Terrans, even in their initial act of war, had displayed a confounding ethical restraint, a prioritization of minimum damage that was entirely alien to the Alliance's scorched earth mentality. They had demonstrated the capacity to destroy entire worlds, but had instead chosen to only disable the core fleet structures, issuing a simple, absolute ultimatum: retreat and never return. The Alliance, misinterpreting the restraint as fear of escalation or a lack of deep reserve power, had merely retreated to lick its wounds and plan the next inevitable encroachment. Now, that miscalculation had cost the Allied systems a star fleet and multiple core worlds, erased from existence with the equivalent of a thought. We are past the point of internal debate, Varthos stated, his voice now a mere whisper that the chamber's acoustic filters amplified to a thunderous, undeniable presence. We must immediately comply with the latter half of their demand, the verifiable cessation of all hostile, exploratory, or surveillance activity. Every single probe, scout ship, and listening post currently directed toward the Sol exclusion zone must be recalled or neutralized by our own forces. We must transmit a complete, abject, and unconditional surrender, acknowledging the complete sovereignty of the Terran consensus and accepting the full terms of their last warning. We must show, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that the governing G-body of the Alliance is in control, and that the actions of the Ninth Group were a rogue, unauthorized act by a faction we ourselves have now purged and disavowed. A wave of protest erupted, a final, desperate surge of military pride and political self-interest. "Surrender to a single message," cried a delegation from the militant Vorlin collective. "They have shown us no fleet, they have shown us no war." The annihilated systems are the fleet, Vorlin, Varthos countered, the logic cold and irrefutable. They have shown us a power that makes a fleet an obsolete concept. We do not surrender to a force. We surrender to a physical law we cannot overcome. We surrender to the cold, absolute truth that there is an entity in this galaxy that operates outside the boundaries of our known physics, guided by an ethical matrix we are only now beginning to comprehend. The Terrans are not our enemy. They are a force of nature, and we have foolishly attempted to dam the tide. Our only path to survival is immediate, unconditional, and absolute compliance. We must demonstrate a level of verifiable, honest subservience that matches the absolute honesty of their threat. We must do so now, before the last warning is replaced by the Annihilation Protocol in its final, comprehensive implementation. The long, agonizing debate that followed was less about strategy and more about the final, shattering of the Alliance's collective self-image. They had always considered themselves the apex predator, the historical culmination of galactic evolution. To be so casually, absolutely, and cleanly neutralized by a species they had dismissed as volatile children was a wound to the very core of their collective identity. But the fear, primal and overriding, eventually won. Within the passing of an Earth hour, a counter-transmission was drafted, a message of pure, unadulterated political and military submission, a plea for continued existence that mirrored the structure of the Terran consensus's own transmission. Cold, formal, and devoid of any emotional language, focused solely on verifiable, immediate compliance. The transmission was sent, a solitary beam of desperate hope fired into the void, aimed at the serene, distant symbol of Earth. The assembly hall fell into a new, profound silence, the silence of a species awaiting a final, unappealable judgment. Minutes stretched into hours, and the hours felt like epochs. The delegates, accustomed to immediate, high-stakes communication, found the delay psychologically agonizing. It suggested that the Terran consensus was not awaiting their surrender with bated breath, but was merely processing the information in a dispassionate, algorithmic manner, calculating the compliance score. Their very existence was reduced to a variable in a Terran equation. Then, after a period of agonizing suspense that left the assembled dignitaries physically drained and emotionally hollowed, the channel activated once more. It was the same unbreakable encrypted conduit, the same non-propagating energy signature, and the same terrifyingly calm, synthesized voice. Transmission received. Allied SYSD-EMS compliance protocol initiated. Your request for continued existence pending verification of cessation of hostilities. Note, the terms of the warning have been registered. The ANNIALATION protocol has been activated as a global deterrence mechanism. Further intrusion will result in the immediate system-wide application of the protocol. Due to the historical precedent of the Allied systems, lack of adherence to treaties, the Terran consensus requires direct, unmediated dialogue. A diplomatic embassy vessel, designated the Unyielding Covenant, is en route to the established neutral zone of Sector 77 Gamma. It is unarmed. It is protected by the ANNIALATION protocol. Any attempt to intercept, hinder, or damage this vessel will be registered as the final ACT of hostility. You will receive its coordinates and ETA momentarily. Your lead diplomatic apparatus must be present and prepared to enter direct, constructive dialogue. End of transmission. The message was an astonishing relief and an equally profound shock. They had not been instantaneously annihilated. They had been given a reprieve, a conditional extension of their existence. But the demand for direct dialogue, the insistence on meeting a human diplomatic vessel, was unprecedented. It suggested that the Terrans were not content with mere military dominance. They sought to understand the philosophical root of the Alliance's persistent aggression, to engage in a conversation that was less about politics and more about the nature of galactic coexistence. The announcement of the Unyielding Covenant being protected by the Annihilation Protocol itself was a stark, chilling display of confidence. A diplomatic ship traveling through the hostile political space of the Alliance, daring any faction to test the absolute finality of their defensive technology. The hum. An approach was cold, logical, utterly devoid of posturing, and terrifyingly efficient. They had eliminated a fleet, erased star systems, and now they were sending a single, unarmed vessel into the heart of their defeated enemy's sphere of influence, not as a show of force, but as an expression of absolute, unassailable confidence in their technological and ethical superiority. The Alliance now understood with a depth of philosophical clarity, that the humans were not operating on the same plane of existence. Their war was a purely defensive, intellectual application of physics, not a chaotic, emotional exercise in territorial gain. The neutral zone of Sector 77 Gamma, a region of space historically devoid of all but the thinnest traces of stellar dust, was transformed into an arena of profound political and existential drama. The Allied Systems delegation, consisting of the most senior members of the triumvirate, including Elder Counselor Varthos, arrived in a somber, heavily protected but ultimately powerless diplomatic cruiser, the Aegis Null. Their massive, intimidating security fleet remained at the absolute limit of the pre-agreed boundary, a testament to their lingering paranoia and a pathetic display of their now meaningless military power. The vessel they were awaiting, the unyielding Covenant, arrived precisely on schedule, emerging from a jump point that defied all established gravimetric dynamics, a maneuver that confirmed the vast gulf in technological understanding. The human ship was not a sleek, intimidating warship, nor a grand, opulent display of terrestrial wealth. It was a study in profound, minimalist functionality, a deep, matte black rhombus of unimaginable scale, almost absorbing the ambient starlight, its surface entirely devoid of visible weapon emplacements, sensor arrays, or external ornamentation. It was an object of pure, rational design, an embodiment of the Terran consensus's core philosophy. Form follows function, and function is absolute efficiency. It felt less like a vessel and more like a carefully crafted piece of advanced philosophical geometry placed in space. A smaller, shuttle-sized craft detached from the Covenant, moving toward the Aegis Null with a steady, unhurried velocity. The Alliance delegation watched the approach on the main view screen, their physiological monitors registering a collective, overwhelming anxiety. This was the moment of the human reveal, the first face-to-face contact since the catastrophic first warning. The memory of the previous Terran commanders, coldly logical, yet possessing an emotional intensity that was deeply unsettling, was fresh in the historical record. The shuttle docked silently. The airlock hissed open, and the human diplomat stepped onto the Aegis Null's receiving platform. He was a singular figure, tall and entirely unarmored, dressed in a simple, perfectly tailored garment of deep charcoal gray, its material shimmering slightly in the atmospheric light. His face was composed, his features sharp but unreadable, and his eyes, a shocking, deep blue, held a patient, intellectual intensity that Varthos immediately recognized as the hallmark of the Terran mind. He was a beacon of cold, unassailable calm in the heart of the Alliance's political chaos. He offered a simple, single gesture, a slight nod of his head, a gesture of intellectual acknowledgement, not subservience or greeting, and his voice, though not the synthesized sound of the warning, carried the same profound, dispassionate clarity. I am Emissary Kalen of the Terran Consensus. I'm here to engage in dialogue regarding the immediate and future parameters of the Sol exclusion zone and the establishment of the Annihilation Protocol as a permanent deterrent. We will not waste time on political theater or performative recrimination. We will proceed immediately to the core philosophical and logistical issues that your species, through your repeated acts of aggression, have forced us to address. The sheer professionalism and the immediate, unyielding focus on the matter at hand, not on the destroyed fleet, not on the erased worlds, but on the protocol itself, was the first great cultural shock. Varthos, taking the lead, stepped forward, his body language carefully controlled to project respect and fear in equal measure. Emissary Kalen, I am Elder Counselor Varthos. We accept the full terms of the Terran Consensus. We offer our complete, abject apology for the rogue actions of the 9th Resource Assessment Group and the subordinate political bodies. We have already initiated a system-wide review of all Alliance assets and personnel to ensure absolute compliance with the cessation of hostilities. Our presence here is to verify our commitment and to seek, if possible, a permanent, stable peace. Kalen's deep blue eyes met Varthos's complex, multifaceted gaze, and the human's response was not one of acceptance or dismissal, but a calm, utterly logical dissection of the proffered apology. An apology is an emotional construct. The Terran Consensus deals in material and political causality. Your apology is noted, but it carries no material weight. We seek only verifiable, persistent behavioral change. The reason for this dialogue is not to accept your surrender, which is an eventuality we have calculated into our long-term projections, but to explain with absolute clarity the nature of the Annihilation Protocol. The continued existence of the Allied systems is, for the moment, deemed beneficial to the stability of this sector. Therefore, we require you to understand the fundamental reality of the deterrent, so that no future act of aggression can be predicated on historical misunderstanding or political arrogance. He paused, a deliberate, cinematic moment of silence that drew all attention to his calm, commanding presence. He spoke not as a diplomat, but as a professor of cold, terrifying physics and ethical calculus. The first warning, which you survived, was a limited-scope, energy-based offensive designed to disable your primary weapons and propulsion systems. It was a demonstration of overwhelming force, tempered by the core Terran ethical imperative of minimum necessary action. It was meant to communicate that we possessed the means to annihilate, but chose not to, in the hopes that simple, rational deterrence would be sufficient. He gestured with a perfectly composed hand toward the vastness of the Alliance-controlled space outside the viewport. You misinterpreted this restraint as either a lack of resource commitment or a fear of escalation. You projected your own species, chaotic, emotional calculus onto our rational, logical, and ethically guided response. This was your fatal mistake. The Annihilation Protocol is not a weapon of war, Kalen continued, his voice maintaining its steady, measured pace, the calm articulation of a horrifying truth. It is a complete, localized, and non-propagating manipulation of the fundamental Planck-level constants of the quantum field. The energy signature you detected during the neutralization of the ninth group was not a blast, but a stabilization field that allowed us to target, with absolute precision, the energy signature of a specific mass of matter. In this case, your ships and the systems they originated from, and to simply rewrite their core quantum reality, dissolving the strong and weak nuclear forces and instantaneously translating all contained matter into a state of zero-point energy equilibrium. In simpler terms, we did not destroy your ships and worlds, Counselor Varthos. We edited them out of existence at the foundational level of reality. The statement was so profound, so terrifying in its implication, that it was not merely a military reveal, but a shattering of the Alliance's entire framework of established physics and ontology. The delegates shifted, a wave of palpable intellectual nausea passing over them. This was not a superior weapon. This was a mastery of reality that put the humans on a scale of power previously reserved for mythological or divine entities. It was the ultimate, clean solution, a world that was erased without the messy debris of a supernova or the radiation signature of a doomsday weapon. It was an act of pure, cold, logical erasure. The ethical consideration in its design is paramount, Kalen went on, his tone reflecting no pride, only objective fact. The protocol is clean, instantaneous, and local. It produces no collateral damage, no radiation fallout, and no instability in the adjacent systems. The Terran consensus, in its ultimate capacity for destruction, chose the solution that adheres most closely to the principle of minimum entropy and maximum ethical precision. We did not want to destroy a star system. We wanted to remove the problem that was located within the star system. This is the difference between your chaotic, emotional warfare and our calculated, ethical application of absolute deterrence. Counselor Lyra, the Sarthian logician, her voice trembling slightly, managed to articulate a question that encompassed the entire triumvirate's desperate curiosity. Emissary, if you possess this capacity, the ability to simply erase reality on a vast scale, why was it not used in the first warning? Why did you endure the historical cost of that first conflict, when a single, decisive act of this nature could have ended all aggression forever? Kalen's expression did not change, but his eyes seemed to gain a new, distant intensity, a look that suggested he was referencing a vast, internal data matrix of history and ethical philosophy. The Terran consensus is guided by a core ethical principle. Escalation must be a response to the enemy's ethical violation, not a preemptive assertion of power. In the first warning, the Alliance sought territorial gain, a predictable, greedy, and common motivation in this chaotic galaxy. Your aggression was conventional. Now and thus, our response was conventional, albeit at a technologically advanced level. We demonstrated the capacity to defend ourselves and nothing more. It was a calculated risk that simple deterrence would hold. Your subsequent action, the deliberate, sanctioned probing of the exclusion zone after the treaty, was not a matter of simple greed. It was an act of profound, arrogant, philosophical disbelief. You disbelieved our word. You disbelieved our capacity. You chose to gamble with the core tenets of sovereignty. That transgression, the ethical violation of the covenant, demanded an equally profound response. The Annihilation Protocol is the final stage deterrent, activated only when the enemy has demonstrated an unwillingness or incapacity to adhere to a rational, ethical, and verifiable agreement. It is not a weapon of first resort, but a mechanism of finality. We did not want to escalate, Counselor. You forced the escalation by demonstrating that conventional deterrence has no meaning to a species incapable of adhering to a rational, stated boundary. The human diplomat's explanation, delivered with such calm, detached logic, was a final, complete intellectual defeat for the Allied systems. The humans were not only the most powerful species in the galaxy, but they were also the most logically consistent and ethically rigorous. They were not governed by the chaos of fear, pride, or ambition, but by a cold, unyielding ethical algorithm that they had translated into the ultimate application of physical law. The Alliance had mistaken their moral compass for weakness and their restraint for a lack of commitment. "We understand, emissary," Varthos stated, his voice now stripped of all political pretense, reduced to a single tone of profound historical awe. "We accept the imposition of the protocol as a permanent, absolute deterrence. We will adhere to every clause of the Treaty of Neutrality and absolute isolation, and we will offer full transparency of our military and exploratory movements. Our goal is peace, and our continued existence is now entirely predicated on the truth of our stated intentions." Kalen nodded, a slight, almost imperceptible movement, and the expression in his eyes finally shifted, a brief flicker of something that was not cold logic but a profound, deep-seated weariness. "That brings us to the true purpose of this dialogue, Counselor Varthos, and the reason why the Terran consensus has chosen to allow your continued existence, rather than implementing the protocol across all hostile domains as a matter of simple, ultimate security. The protocol is a mechanism for local stability, but it is not the ultimate function of the Terran consensus. Our isolation was not driven by arrogance, but by a necessity far greater than the political squabbles of this relatively small galactic sector. We require your existence, Varthos, because we require all stable, technologically advanced civilizations to eventually understand and participate in the true, grand, and immediate threat to all life in the cosmos." This was the core of the profound, unexpected cultural contrast. The humans were not self-serving isolationists. They were merely operating on a scale of crisis that the Alliance could not comprehend. Kalen's revelation of a true purpose shifted the entire political dynamic, transforming the Allied systems from a defeated enemy into a necessary component of a larger existential strategy. The Annihilation Protocol, Counselor, is a local defense against disruptive, chaotic elements such as yours. But its technology, the capacity to manipulate the quantum field at the Planck level, was not developed to counter simple galactic aggression. It was developed as a defense against a cosmic historical entity that our deep space monitoring assets first detected during the height of our own internal planetary conflicts, an entity whose existence redefined our species and drove us into our state of permanent, defensive isolation. Kalen paused, allowing the gravity of his words to settle, the immense, unthinkable scale of the Terran reality suddenly dwarfing the recent, petty conflict. He activated a miniature holoprojector embedded in his wrist cuff. The ominous symbol of Earth vanished, replaced by a deep space sensor image, a massive, impossibly complex structure, a lattice of non-baryonic matter stretching across light years, a structure that was absorbing the light and energy of a neighboring nebula, a silent, cosmic vacuum cleaner of unimaginable power. It was an image of pure, ancient, and absolute horror. We call it the Xylos Vex anomaly, an abandoned, self-replicating megastructure, a remnant of a species that existed in the absolute dawn of this universe, a species whose final philosophical act was to create a mechanism for the consumption of all organized matter and energy, a silent, slow-moving wave of entropic annihilation. It is not an enemy that seeks war or resources or do. Minion, it is a fundamental process, an autonomous, unthinking construct that is slowly, inexorably, erasing this quadrant of the galaxy from the historical record. The image held the delegates captive, their minds struggling to comprehend the scale, the cold, geological horror of a threat that was not a rival, but a terminal physical law. The recent conflict with the humans, the annihilated fleet, the erased worlds, suddenly seemed like the squabbling of children in the shadow of an incoming supernova. The sheer, terrifying objectivity of the threat was the ultimate form of fear. Our technological advancements, including the core field dynamics of the Annihilation Protocol, were reverse-engineered from the remnants of Xylo's Vex technology, an understanding gained at immense, catastrophic cost, Kalen explained, his voice now carrying a note of true, philosophical weight, the weight of a species carrying an impossible burden. Our isolation was not a retreat. It was a necessary pause to develop the strategic and technological means to counter a threat that is not merely existential, but cosmic. We have spent generations building a massive, interdimensional energy field, a counterforce to this entropic wave, and the energy requirements are astronomical. The entire power output of the Sol system is barely enough to maintain the structural integrity of this counterfield. He gestured to the surrounding galactic expanse. The allied systems in your chaotic, aggressive state are a drain on the immediate sector's stability. Your perpetual warfare, your internal political instability, and your arrogant disregard for the concept of absolute boundaries were drawing our attention away from the primary objective. The last warning was not about your fleet, Counselor. It was a clear, final declaration that you were disrupting a far greater, more critical strategic reality. The warning was not for you to fear us, but for you to get out of the way of the inevitable, grand, and silent war we are already fighting for the survival of the cosmos. Your Annihilation Protocol was activated because you presented a localized, destabilizing threat to the critical path of the true, ultimate defense system. The revelation was a hammer blow of historical perspective. The humans, the feared, volatile, and impossibly powerful Terran consensus, were not a threat, but the sole, unyielding guardians of the known universe, silently defending all life from an unthinking, ancient entropy machine. Their terrifying, absolute power was not a tool of conquest, but a defensive necessity, a terrible responsibility they had taken upon themselves because no other species in the sector possessed the philosophical clarity or technological capacity to comprehend the problem. We now require your assistance, Varthos, not as allies in a political sense, but as functional components in a necessary system, Kalen concluded, his gaze steady and demanding. Your internal political stability is now a prerequisite for your continued existence, because the resources and strategic depth of your sector are needed for the countermeasure. Your scientists and engineers, if they can overcome the psychological shock of this revelation, must be brought into the project. Your military forces must be reorganized into a defensive buffer against any other opportunistic elements in the outer sectors, freeing our limited, high-level assets for the grander engagement. The fate of your systems is not dependent on our forgiveness, Counselor. It is dependent on your immediate, verifiable capacity to operate as a stable, logical, and contributing factor in the absolute, silent war against the Xylo's Vex anomaly. Your annihilation would be a strategic waste of resources. Your cooperation is a strategic necessity. That is the final, true meaning of Earth's last warning. Varthos felt the immense, generational weight of this truth settle upon his ancient being. The fear, the political paranoia, the arrogance of the Alliance, all had evaporated, replaced by a profound, humbling awe and a cold, shared terror of the cosmic silence that the humans had been fighting, alone, for all this time. The humans were not gods, but rational, ethical beings who had simply faced a universal problem with a universal solution. They had withdrawn, not out of isolationist pride, but because they understood that the petty squabbles of a young galaxy were an insult and a dangerous distraction from the single, unyielding necessity of survival. Their calmness, their ethical rigor, their terrifying logic, and their absolute power were all products of this single, ultimate realization. The universe is fundamentally hostile, and the only path to survival is absolute, verifiable, collective responsibility. Emissary Kalen, Varthos finally replied, the formal title now carrying a new, profound reverence. The Allied systems will comply. We will submit all required political, technological, and scientific assets. We accept the burden of the responsibility you have carried, and we pledge our complete, unyielding commitment to the survival of the organized cosmos. The last warning has been received. The message is now understood not as a threat, but as a statement of existential reality. We are ready to learn the true nature of the fight, and to stand, finally, with the Terran consensus, not as an enemy or an ally, but as a humbled, necessary component in the unyielding covenant against the void. The grand assembly of the triumvirate, witnessing the transmission from the Aegis Null, fell into a final, absolute silence, a silence not of fear, but of profound, shared understanding, and the realization that the greatest wars are not fought with fire and noise, but with cold, absolute, ethical logic against an enemy that doesn't even know it is fighting. The long road of Terran history, one of self-mastery, internal conflict, and ultimate unity, had not prepared them for galactic conquest, but for the silent, lonely, and philosophical task of being the unyielding guardians of all that is.